According to Dun History, a history of Florida through Black Eyes, which is a website, the earliest traced to Key Biscayne connects to a Spanish man named Pedro Fornells. He moved to uninhabited Key Biscayne with the goal of establishing and settling it along with his family, associates, and slaves. The mission, however, failed due to the fact of pirating. And keep in mind, this is in the 1700s, late 1700s, early 1800s. Pirating was a big thing, and the lack of protective resources and a lot of uncharted territory, it was anybody's land. So the land was not protected. He wasn't protected enough, and it was very risky to stay there. So he moved back to St. Augustine. It's also my opinion or analysis that it could have been attached to Indians as well, like nearby tribes didn't like them on their land because Indians were there first. So that probably was another factor as to why Mr. Pedro decided to go back to St. Augustine. However, again, according to Dunn's website, not everyone went back with Mr. Pedro. Mr. Pedro had an associate, a white associate named Vincent. He stayed along with some of Pedro's slaves. Mr. Vincent and the slaves worked together, and they grew things like corn and coffee. This venture lasted many seasons. However, the ultimate fate of that endeavor, those slaves and Mr. Vincent and their endeavor of growing coffee and corn and other things, is unknown. However, it can be concluded that these slaves were probably the first black settlers in Miami-Dade County. It's a nice sunny day here in South Florida. I'm here in Key Biscayne, and I'm headed to the Cape, Florida Lighthouse. I read about it in Dunn's book, and I've been seeing little things about it. But I want to know more about it, about the history in terms of really the black history, about the slavery and whatnot. So we're gonna see. Okay, so I'm here at the Cape, Florida Lighthouse, the oldest structure in Florida. I'm waiting on a tour guide, a park ranger to come to give us a tour. I'm here at 10 o'clock on the dot. This is such a nice, natural, rich space I'm in right now. So I'll be back. So the park rangers at the front informed me that they're not going to open the lighthouse, or they decided not to open the lighthouse because the wind was blowing too much and there's water surrounding the lighthouse, which I did see. However, they did tell me that if I found a ranger around, that I could ask them to possibly help me and maybe give at least a tour around it. I would hope they would let me inside the lighthouse. So we'll see what happens. I'm gonna try and see if I can find a ranger around here to let me inside the lighthouse, okay? Be right back.
So my name is Andrea. I am a park ranger here at Billback's Cape Florida State Park. We do interpretation here, and one of the things we talk about is our lighthouse compound area. So for general basis, this whole Cape Florida area is very important lots of history down here. Before the lighthouse was built, actually, this whole area was very important because lots of freed black slaves and even black Seminoles would come down here to the Cape, and they would boats would be lined up over here on the Cape to take them over to the Bahamas. So this is actually an area for what was known as the Saltwater Underground Railroad. A lot of people were able to escape and find freedom. Unfortunately, obviously, once the lighthouse was built, this kind of put a stop to the Underground Railroad, but a lot of people were able to find freedom off.
That brings up a good question. So basically, the lighthouse was supposed to guard for things like that.
Was supposed to
Was a lookout for things like that?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
So it was just the reason why it stopped was obviously nobody inhabited this land. So it was a good access point. Pretty much the only people who would come down here were the native tribe people. They would come down here to escape the muggy weather in the Everglades. So they would come here to the coastline and they would hang out. So we didn't really have many of the Americans coming down here until they decided, hey, we're going to build a lighthouse down here. So the reason why they built the lighthouse was because of our reefs. So we do have reefs 5 miles offshore, and a lot of sailors would come in and they would crash onto these reefs. So that was a loss of profit, loss of supplies. So they decided we're going to build a lighthouse to help the sailors navigate. So they built the lighthouse here, and then obviously once everybody started coming down here to build the lighthouse, the U.S. government, it did put a stop to the Underground Railroad. There was too many government officials coming down, patrolling this area from the army, so they couldn't escape over to the Bahamas anymore.
Okay, so do you know anything about the slaves that were here, pretty much, or like what they were?
I do not know. I do know a lot of the majority of the people who did escape over to the Bahamas were black Seminoles.
Okay.
So they did live somewhere up by the New River, over off to the Everglades, and they would come down here. Unfortunately, I don't have
I thank you for that information.
Yeah, no worries. So then pretty much after this lighthouse was built, this whole area was not very inhabited. This was built back in 1825. The lighthouse keeper and his family would live here. It was very isolated from everything else. So if they had to get supplies, they would have to go either to St. Augustine or to Key West. So obviously that's quite of a trek. So they kind of fended for themselves. It wasn't until 1867 that this lighthouse actually went out of commission, so it's not recognized as a lighthouse anymore. There is a new lighthouse, so I was talking about the reefs. The reefs are found 5 miles offshore, so sailors kept crashing into those reefs even though we did have the lighthouse, so they decided to build a lighthouse offshore. So if you look out when you get to the base of the lighthouse, you'll see there is a lighthouse right in the middle of the ocean that is called Fowey Rocks. This area is also another important site for historical reasons. A lot of those Seminoles would come down here, as I was saying, to escape the summer heat. So they pretty much weren't used to a lot of Americans being here and taking over their land. So actually 10 years after the lighthouse was built in 1836, the Tequestas and the Seminoles came down and they actually attacked our lighthouse. So before, the lighthouse was not as tall as it is today. It was only about 65 feet tall, but they came over and they attacked the lighthouse. They didn't want them to be there, this was their land. So they unfortunately were not successful. They kind of did a bit of damage to the lighthouse and then they retreated back. But this kind of started the Seminole Wars that were happening here in Florida. So the government came down and the army came down and they kind of stationed here at Cape Florida for quite a bit. They actually started to learn the ways of the Native Americans. They would go into the canals with canoes. They would try and navigate through the mangroves, and this actually helped them or gave them an advantage during the Second Seminole Wars. So that's why they kind of beat them during that time period. They were able to push them back. Florida. This went through several different owners. It got passed on and passed on. People started coming down once Flagler built his railroad system. So a lot of people were coming down to South Florida. They were kind of inhabiting the areas. And then people were looking around here and they're like, what should we do with this land? So one of the ideas, and they did start kind of going forward with the plan, they were actually going to tear down all the trees and wildlife, and they did do that. And then they planted what is known, or put down marl, which is a type of substrate, so they could build buildings. So they kind of want to turn this into like a more city area, kind of like how the rest of the cities look like. And then they wanted to build a highway that would connect Key Biscayne down to Key Largo. So that would be more of a straight shot down to the Keys instead of people having to go out west and go through the Everglades and, you know, go down to the Keys. So, you know, they started going forward with that plan. But we did have Mr. Bill Baggs, who was a editor for the Miami News at the time. He was an advocate for lots of social issues. He was very outspoken. He didn't really care. He wanted his opinion out there, and he pretty much defended what he believed was right. And one of his things was obviously about the environment. So he wanted to help preserve this land. He wanted people to come and have a place to kind of relax and get away from that city life and the bustle. So obviously, if he was still alive today, I'm sure he would not like Miami at all of what it turned out to be. But he was very he was advocating a lot for helping preserve this land. So the person who owned this land at the time, her name was Anna Garcia. She actually was in talks with Bill Baggs, and he was telling her, hey, just sell it to the state so it could become a state park and it could be preserved. So even though it was a loss of profit for her, she didn't really make that much money off of it. She did sell it to the state, and in 1967 we became a state park. So all of the wildlife you see here has been preserved. It did look a little bit different. So Florida is home of the non-invasive, non-native plants that we have here. So we actually had lots of Australian pine trees. And those pine trees were brought over, obviously not from this area. They were brought over because they can drain wetlands pretty well. So obviously, before all this development happened, Florida was pretty much a huge wetland. So they would plant the pine trees to help drain those wetlands so they could build their buildings on it.
That's interesting. Like you would think it would just be a machine that did this stuff.
No, yeah.
But they actually got very like technical and scientific and got plants.
Yeah, the plant life.
Like that.
Yeah.
Okay, wow.
So they would bring the Australian pine trees, and you can still find them here in Florida. I know up in Hollywood there are still some areas along the coastline where they have them. And these Australian pine trees, obviously they're bad. They grow really tall. They cover so much shade. It doesn't allow the native plants to grow below them. And then the pine needles, when they drop the pine needles and they accumulate, they actually kind of they aid in the coastal erosion. So they're not really good for the environment. Okay. And they pretty much destroy the land, and that causes obviously shoreline erosion. Okay. So they had to start cutting down these pine trees, but that was a lot of work. But unfortunately and fortunately, in 1992, we actually had a hurricane. A lot of people know Hurricane Andrew. It was a Category 5 hurricane, and it did cause a lot of destruction here in Miami. But it did help the park in that it actually helped knock down and cut away a lot of those trees. So when you actually entered into our state park right after Hurricane Andrew, you can see the lighthouse from the ranger station. So there was no tree cover, and it just helped kickstart that initiative to get rid of all these Australian pine trees. So with the help of lots of volunteers and park staff, they were able to remove and help plant all the natural wildlife, that native life that was here. So all the trees that you see here in our park and all the plants, this is actually all post Hurricane Andrew. So it's been thriving pretty well, and yeah, we haven't really had any issues. This park is pretty much going back to what it should look like naturally.
Awesome. I've seen some mangrove areas as well.
Yes, we have some mangroves over on the west side. Obviously, this whole coastline would have been all mangroves if we didn't have like man-made beaches. But yeah, for the most part, everything is pretty much back to normal, and then the park is thriving really well.
Awesome.
Lost a lot of our coastline, so it's actually receded in a lot more. And that's obviously, because you see this is all open, there's nothing there to stop the waves from coming in. And even today, you can see where our high tide came in. We're getting lots of storm surges, and just the tides are coming up, and sooner or later it's going to come up pretty high.
So it's an environmental thing, and because of it's an environmental thing.
Yeah.
So that's the address, 1855. Like, what is
that? So the lighthouse has gone through, I believe it's 3 restorations. So I think that was from the last one where they updated the door. So that was from 1855.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because when it was originally built in 1826, it actually had a wooden door and a wooden staircase. But during the attack from the Tequestas, since they didn't have guns at the time to shoot, they used bow and arrow and fire. So it actually caught the whole door on fire, and the staircase got on fire. And obviously it was destroyed. So, but then they thought, hey, let's make it an iron cast door instead. Kind of worked out on itself. And now it sits at 95 feet tall.
Okay. Interesting.
So we did have two assistants here during the attack on the lighthouse. One of them was Aaron Carter, who was a slave, and he was an assistant of the lighthouse. So he was guarded to guard the lighthouse here to defend it from anybody or anything. So when the Tequetzes came down to attack the lighthouse, they went inside the lighthouse to defend it. He was struck before he got into the lighthouse, unfortunately, but they did make their way up to the top, and they did saw off the staircase so that the Native Americans wouldn't reach them at the top. Now, obviously, with all the fire that was going on, it did cause a big fire to happen inside the lighthouse. You don't want to be inside a lighthouse when there's a fire, because all that brick pretty much kind of contains that fire in there. So it was really hot up at the top, and they were kind of trying to find a safe place to be where they wouldn't be shot with arrows. Unfortunately, Mr. Carter did not survive the attack here at the lighthouse, but yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's good. But where's he buried? I heard he was buried around here somewhere.
That I do not know. Nobody has told me, but yeah, I do not know. We do have this whole area. We're not allowed to touch it or dig into it, because this is all considered an archaeological site. So many people have found lots of artifacts in this whole area.
His bones are here somewhere. Probably. We don't know.
Probably. Yeah. I don't know.
They say, I read that he was buried near this house, right? Yeah.
Well, this one is not the real house.
Okay.
And the land, from what I was told, actually used to extend further out. So we actually have lost land.
Oh, wow. Because erosion.
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm not sure exactly, but I do know, I'm sure there's artifacts.
Well, it could have been it could have been there. Yeah. Okay, but that's life,
Yeah.
All right. So I mean, now So let's talk about the basics. What is the importance of this lighthouse? Like, what did this lighthouse serve to do?
So this lighthouse pretty much was built to help with sailors. So obviously we have the Florida Reef Tract over here. Reef tracts are very shallow, so when there's a lot of ships coming in, bringing supplies up to St. Augustine, they would crash into the reef. So that was a big thing. They would lose all the supplies they were carrying, lose the ships. There was a lot of money lost. So they wanted to build a lighthouse. So the lighthouse has the light up on top that shines at night, so that the sailors know where the land is, and they pretty much get a basis of, oh, we're near land, and it was supposed to warn them about the reefs. Unfortunately, it didn't really do that great of a job, because people still kept crashing on the reefs. But they did end up building Fowey Rocks, which is the lighthouse out 5 miles offshore. So it's all the way out there. It looks like an Eiffel Tower.
Yeah, it does look like an Eiffel Tower, actually.
But that is actually built right on the reefs, and it does the same thing. It has a light that shines at night to warn sailors, hey, there is a reef right around here, proceed with caution.
Okay. I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to visit the Lighthouse compound. What are my takeaways? Environmental and preservation. We have to be consistent with preserving our history, and we have to be consistent with doing our best to maintain and take care of the environment. Thanks for watching, and thanks for letting me share.